So, for those of you who haven't been before, and a reminder for those who have, President's series of events are intended to take two hopefully interesting people, so the pressure is all on Chris and Tom tonight, who come at it with their own perspective on what they want to talk about, more or less related to cybernetics, we hope, on the way through, and they get the first hour uninterrupted talking, and we then try in the second hour or thereabouts to synthesize the common threads out of what they've said, the common understandings, some shared ideas and emergent understandings. And sometimes it works brilliantly and sometimes it works superbly, but it always works. We always get something good coming out at the end. So that's the game. It's not difficult. There are no particular rules other than please be quiet while they're talking, so that we can listen. Take notes. Use chat to put questions in and all that sort of stuff. So that saves me having to think of them all. Feel free to be provocative, awkward, difficult. I know you will. You don't really need the invitation. So tonight's first speaker, who's going to go first? I need to find my stopwatch at this point, don't I? Otherwise I'll never know when to shut him up. Here's my friend Chris Singer. Chris and I have been, we met through a youth road safety project about 6 years ago, while Chris still had a job. He subsequently retired as, get it right, I think acting Deputy Chief Constable of West Mercia at the moment of his retirement. I think I've got that one right, Chris. And we still collaborate together on a number of interesting areas of life. 32 years in the police, which is more than long enough for any normal human being, I think. Now working in resilience and areas of national defence, and has had some interesting times dealing with some of the COVID issues and that sort of stuff, as well as part of his retirement activity, which is quite good. And Chris is going to talk to us about cybernetics leadership in the public sector. And Chris, I'm just going to hand over to you and shut up, and I'll give you a 5-minute warning when we get near the end.
Fantastic. Thanks, John. It's a real pleasure to be here, folks. As John said, by way of a little bit of introduction there, I rose to the rank of Deputy Chief Constable. But not only am I operationally strong, but I also had an organisational leadership role, which I think was really important.
Can I interrupt? Sorry.
An echo.
You're breaking up quite a lot. I don't know whether that's just for me or others. Yeah, Raoul's feeling it too. So have you got a microphone plugged in or
no,
crackle somewhere?
It normally works beautifully.
I know. Anyway, carry on. Just be aware.
You could try switching off your sound while you're talking. There's a heck of a lot of echo on this.
Right, let's try that.
Unless somebody else has left there.
Now I can't hear you. Any better?
Yeah.
Okay.
Keep going.
So 32 years, rank of Deputy Chief Constable. Operationally strong, but also organisationally strong. I was the head of business improvement. I led transformation programs. I worked in the Home Office. I worked in the Cabinet Office, delivering new operating models. And so quite a lot of experience, and also worked across the channel in Europe in relation to quite a large programme to harmonise standards within Europe. So I did things like Six Sigma, MSP, Prince, and all of those good things. And since retirement now, I am an associate lecturer with Coventry University, working with the civil service in relation to their future leadership scheme. What I would ask is Chatham House rules, please, because I'm going to tell you some stories. So I would ask for confidentiality in relation to that. And some of the content I'm going to talk about is deliberately pejorative in order just to prompt the thinking, and particularly the link across to Tom's subject, which at the outset you may think is going to be difficult to make, but I know it's there. I don't want to necessarily leave you with the notion that all of the public sector are incapable of delivering improvement and change and taking note of data and such like, because there are certainly examples where that has been done and done very effectively. But I will argue that structures, culture, traditional leadership, which the public sector embraces very well, does constrain opportunity for radical and effective reform. And the story I'm going to start with is this, that when I was in the police, we decided in 2012 to form a rowing team in advance of the Olympics and to row against the Navy. So we had 4 rowers, a cox and a coach, and we lost the race, which was a bit of a shame. So we reviewed the result, and it was decided that the rowers hadn't rowed hard enough. So they needed more supervision in order to make them row harder. So what we did was we promoted the cox to chief cox. We took one of the rowers and made them deputy cox, and made sure that the remaining 3 rowers really were very well supervised in order to make them row a lot harder. And in fact, we renamed them all propulsion officers, just to really reinforce the importance of their role. And again, we lost. So we did a lot of analysis. We looked at the data and we assembled a task force, and it was determined that the management structure was wrong. So we renamed it all, wasn't a rowing team anymore. We promoted the cox again, and we decided also that we needed to get public support. So we took one of the propulsion officers and made them a communications officer. So we had a communications officer, a chief cox, a deputy cox, and a coach. We gave them all shortened names: ACC, BCO, PO, CC, DCC. And again, this time we lost again by miles. The 2 rowers just didn't make up the pace. So I disbanded the whole thing, removed the posts, and I chalked them all up as cashable efficiency savings. That went down very well indeed. Now, it's a joke, clearly. However, in a falls not very far away, there are things happening not dissimilar to that. And actually, it's the culture of policing, and it's the culture within the public sector to often look at what's going on in the organisation and leap to conclusions in relation to the cause of those issues, and to invent new solutions that don't necessarily fix the problem, because there's insufficient attention given at the outset to the true nature of the origins of the problem. And part of that as well, in terms of finding those solutions, is because policing, public sector, been around for a long time. They're old organisations. Civil service, right the way back to 1842, Northcote Trevelyan, policing, right the way back to Peel. And they believe, as a result, their culture believes that they know the solutions. And I recall as a very young PC, very young police constable, I was directed to go to a report of theft of milk at 7:20 in the morning, where a pint of milk had been nicked from a doorstep of a house. So I went there, recorded it all, went back to the police station, and my sergeant said to me, "Have you done house to house?" So I said, "Well, no, because the milk was delivered at 4 o'clock this morning, and the householder got up at 5 o'clock and found the milk was missing, but everyone else around is still asleep. So not a lot of point going to do house to house, really." But no, I had to go back and do house to house because that was what we did. I wasn't really effective or great use of my time. We weren't looking at the output in relation to the benefits from house to house inquiries, correlating that then to the simple act of the theft, and actually looking at those, using that information in order to improve our efficiency. And indeed, we would conduct random patrols without any direction at all, which is a topic I will return to. And the other thing then that comes down to it is that the culture within quite a lot of those organisations rewards you for doing peculiar things. So again, young PC, the co-op store used to get all of their goods delivered during the dark hours in a big basket that was pushed to the back of the store and just left out in the open. And yes, you guessed it, lots of things used to get nicked out of it. And so I went down, recorded the theft, had to record house-to-house inquiries, even though it was like 5 o'clock in the morning again, to see if anyone had seen what happened. But of course they hadn't. It was in the back of a store. So then what I did on my own initiative the next night was sat up there, and at 5 o'clock in the morning, sure enough, along comes local criminal, reaches in, nicks some milk or whatever else it was out of the bottom of this basket, and off he goes. I catch him, arrest him, prosecute him. And I got a superintendent's commendation for that. I said, well, you know, why are you rewarding me for that when actually the output that I've used there is just sort of common sense, and surely we can solve crime better than just by applying those sort of things. And all of those things struck with me as I worked up then through my career, working in the civil service, partner agencies, social care, and all sorts of things like that. Because I see the same sort of challenges. And what I kind of take it back is this, that if we look right away back at the origins of why we have things like the police force, the civil service, the health, various health bodies and what have you. Well, Thomas Jefferson says the purpose of government is to enable the people of a nation to live in safety and happiness. Government exists for the interests of the government, not the governors, which is a bit of a moot point at the moment, I suppose. And how does it do that? Well, in terms of safety, external threats guarded by the armed service, internal threats by police forces, regulations, regulatory bodies, all of those sort of things. Happiness, health systems, regulation and such like. And of course, to do all of that, in order to perform those functions, we build the bureaucracy to fulfill those functions. And those bureaucracies create their own level of politics. You get the self-promotion piece that's clearly apparent within them, and self-interest, despite what we need to see as the ambitions that are espoused in the Nolan Principles for Public Life. So in addition to having that profound tension between the elected bodies and the bureaucracy, we also have the bureaucracy in itself, protecting itself. And that very quickly becomes the culture within it. And as an example, I led a transformation to move the administration of fixed penalty tickets to an online platform that could have saved 54 jobs, removed 54 jobs in their entirety. So probably about overall £2.1 million worth of savings a year. Did that happen? No, because some of those jobs were in relatively low skilled and low waged, and they existed in a deprived area of the force, which the Police and Crime Commissioner was closely linked to. And secondly, reducing that area of the business by 54 people reduced the command size of those people above it. So there was a lack of buy-in in relation to that because it was seen as diminishing rather than enhancing. And those systems are also constructed to conspire against efficiency. For a time, police officers of certain ranks were paid according to the size, the scale of the command that they led. That was to recognise that in a force like the Metropolitan Police, their commands are many thousands of officers, whereas if you're in Warwickshire, it's probably tens. So people were rewarded based upon the number of people that they commanded. Well, of course, that completely conspires against any effort then to improve efficiency, because actually what they want to do is build numbers. And that's by no means unique to policing. So there's that sort of element, if you like, of the turkeys and voting for Christmas. And the culture also conspires against it as well. And I talked earlier on about sort of conducting random patrol in policing. It was calculated that some years ago that once every 10 years, a police constable on random patrol may encounter somebody committing a serious crime, and that was burglary principally. And yet police officers patrol pretty well aimlessly. And I, in fact, caught a burglar climbing through a window once in my career. So probably wasn't far removed from right. And if the primary purpose of policing is to protect life, how does that equate then to just sort of random aimlessly patrolling, wasted effort, and the structures and systems that are put in place in order to support that? Where was the analysis? Where is the analysis of what's effective? Where's the use of information from that analysis? How could we say we were being either efficient or indeed effective? And so as I rose through the ranks, I continued to try and bring about change in relation to those things in order to improve what we were doing. But the other element here is it's not solely down to leadership. Police officers possess and are required to use extremely high levels of discretion. Often they respond to situations alone, and they regard their use of powers in singular. They have to be able to make their decisions about their use of powers themselves, search, penalty, and all of those sort of things. And in very few instances is that use of discretion removed. And in fact, it's the cornerstone of policing by consent. So what that does, it breeds a sense of belief in your own judgment. Because by and large in policing, and I'm talking a lot about policing, I will relate it across to the civil service and the health sector in a minute, but by and large in policing, promotion comes from within, comes from those people who joined as constables and get promoted upwards. So you then get to a position where for much of their careers, they will have been used to making independent decisions based upon their own judgment at that time, on the situation that was confronting them at that time, and acting accordingly. And of course that carries through then. As they become more senior leaders, they're used to that style of decision making. So the concept, for instance, of drawing together many strands of information around a wicked organisational issue, or an issue that relates directly to making an organisation more effective and more efficient by drawing down strands of information, data, all of those sort of things. It's actually quite alien. I can see Richard right in the middle of my screen, and I'm hoping he's nodding, but and in agreement with me, because he and I share the same background. And what that also does is leads to a challenge of authority. So not only have you got a situation where leaders are born in that culture, but also you get a challenge to authority. So when you do start to bring about things that are radically different, you'll get a resistance to it. So for instance, I talked earlier about directed patrols. I brought in a system where there were directed patrols, which were using data in order to try and say to people, we need you in this area at this time, because that's when you'll create most effect. We called them red zones and such like. And there was complete resistance to it because, no, I know best, boss. I know where I need to be. I know my patch. I'm a police constable and I know this. So actually trying to get that changed to a different way of working was extremely difficult. Now, I've mentioned, of course, self-interest, and there are notable exceptions to it. In a local authority that was facing huge budget reductions and growing demand, the twin drivers of change in the public sector, social care faced acute issues, which of course it still does. I was a non-executive director in that local authority on secondment from policing, and we knew we had to do something radically different. There was knock-on in terms of primary care, there was knock-on in terms of hospitals and other emergency services, from delays in the system, all sorts of things conspiring against the local authority providing its services effectively and efficiently. So we did a lot of problem solvers. We defined the issue, we looked at analysis and such like, we took the data, we implemented, we monitored. All of that's easy, right? And no, it wasn't. It was blimmin' hard. Analysis showed that across the 5 agencies, NHS, Hospital Trust, Primary Care, Mental Health, Local Authority, third sector suppliers, there were 5 sets of commissioning. And we reckoned that out of each pound that arrived at the top end in order to provide service from, if you like, the government coffer, about 11 pence was actually spent on service delivery at the point of need. So what was the solution to that? Well, we determined that we would pull budgets together and we would create a single commissioning body to strip out all that extraneous level of service provision. Logical, yeah, a logical approach. Of course it was. But to do it required the agencies separately involved with understanding the need that they individually had. Secondly, being prepared to see that service by an arm's length agreement. And thirdly, of course, surrender sovereignty in relation to some of their staff, or indeed surrender staff. And we met huge resistance. Now, John said in my introduction that this was partly about leadership. Leadership there did create the compelling case. A lady called Carol Burgoyne, who rightly received an award on the back of it, created the compelling, that single unifying vision and inspired others to deliver a better tomorrow. But in terms of that sort of cybernetics approach around drawing things together, looking at holistic solutions and such like, actually the leadership initially was conspiring against that. And innovation, in order to do that, our traditional business systems that exist within those sort of organisations conspire, I think, against that sense of innovation. Again, one of the features that's within policing, but it's also present in other discipline bodies such as fire, ambulance and such like, is that there is a hierarchy, and it's in place for a very good reason. Because in an operational setting, you need to be able to say go and do, and know that they are going to go and do in an operational setting. So the hierarchy is important. But of course, that hierarchy in its own right will stifle innovation. Doing some work in the Treasury at the moment with the Treasury and other civil service departments. And the Treasury in particular is a body that you cannot, as a junior in the organisation, start influencing change upwards, because the hierarchy just will not allow you to do it. You have to go through the chain of command. And particularly where, again, you come to that point where there's entry into the organisation at the bottom level. Broadly speaking, most of the public sector still has that. Military clearly has direct entry at the officer rank. But you get generic joiners who then need to start adapting and learning specific skills. And skills around things like business change are not sexy skills to learn when you're in a uniformed organisation like the police or the fire service or the ambulance service and such like. Now, the military does recruit business managers in order to do these sort of things. But generally speaking, competence is judged on you in the organisation, in the role that you serve in the organisation. So I was a competent assistant chief constable, I'd like to think I was. And that was the judge of my competence. So I could take command of firearms incidents, I could deliver public order policing and all of those sort of things. I don't recall ever, I don't think, my competence on maybe one occasion, strategic Police National Assessment Centre for the Strategic Command Course, my competence being assessed around bringing about change in the organisation, analysing data, you're making positive use of data and such like. Because of course we came up through an organisation that was designed for a purpose, to keep people safe. So I think it's important to recognise that that might well be the case across a large number of organisations as well. And I remember as well that and you know, the story alongside that is, and Rich will bear this out, I know, that as senior commanders in policing, not only were you working on the organisation to try and make it more effectively, at the same time you're running incidents as well. So you've feet in many, many camps. I well remember being in a business meeting where we were trying to address the issues that were arising out of the 2008 economic crash and the diminishment of services in the public sector. Sat there with some very senior individuals. We'd pulled people down from Whitehall and all sorts. A lot of effort to get the meeting together. Really key for me. I was a geographic commander. My phone rang and it was, boss, we've had an attempt suicide bombing in Exeter. You needed. And that was it. I was gone. So the pulls on you are very different. And also the culture within, particularly policing, and I'll come up to my final point, so I don't know how I'm doing on time, John, but hopefully I think I'm about right on the 20 minutes. The pulls also on policing. So policing has tried to bring about direct entry in order to address some of the issues that I've highlighted, particularly in relation to competence around change and that innovation approach and such like. And doing assessments for direct entry inspectors. We had one very competent individual who had come forward for selection. So these are people from all sorts of walks of life coming forward to be an inspector in policing. And she had come forward with a background in banking, having delivered some significant improvements with the organisation that she represented. She was quietly spoken. She was very unassuming. And the judgment that was levied upon her as we were going through the scores that the candidates got was, oh, can you see her leading a night shift on a busy section when there's drunks all around you? And I said, hang on a sec, that's not what we're looking for. But the culture was conspiring against policing, reaching out to something different in order to get that difference that it so desperately needed. Finally, my final point, unless something is badly wrong, the public sector is rarely faced with an ultimatum to change or disappear. There are some notable exceptions. I know that bodies get renamed. Public Health England is now a completely different name, arguably doing exactly the same thing under the Health Security Agency. But very rarely would you see a situation where you've done it so wrong, so we're just going to get rid of you. I know Minneapolis tried to get rid of their police department and it didn't work particularly well. And of course, in the converse is in the private sector. If you get it wrong, you're likely to disappear. And we can all think of the high street names and such like who've done that. So it's very much the case that actually not only the purpose that those bodies exist for, but also the culture and traditions and structures can conspire against these organisations really adopting an approach that leads them to deliver effective solutions to the problems that they face. And there you go. I think that was pretty well bang on, wasn't it, Mr. Beckford? Professor?
2344.34, Chris. So you know you're marginal, but you're okay. Not that I'm counting, obviously. So if I was to be, because what we do at this point is we will take one or two questions if there's something immediate there, but otherwise we'll crack on fairly shortly. If I summarise that whole thing, that would sound like there is an enormous vacuum in leadership of public sector organisations, to the point where, in effect, there is no governance beyond the operational level that makes any meaningful difference to the way they work. I'm looking at you two guys. I mean, I'm looking at an audience here where roughly half, I would say, work in various public sector organisations or have done. How does that feel as a statement, folks? Scary, isn't it? Alan's got his thumb up. Richard's stopped giggling. He's collecting the pension now, so he's happy.
Is the assumption that somehow in the private sector management is so much better?
Great question, Angus. Thank you. Anybody? I think Angus and I might agree that governance in the private sector is as bad as, if not worse than, in some cases, public sector.
If I could make an observation, John. What has just been described, I've seen in organisations, private companies, public companies, right across the board. It seems to be a common denominator of our species rather than a public or private body.
What I've seen in public sector, in the NHS, in British Rail, in the days when there was a British Rail and elsewhere, is that the government intervention, and it's the same today with the NHS, that the government intervention from a remote height jumps down and imposes various rules and principles and budgets and so on. And the organizations may have a kind of purpose, but they don't have an adequate means of generating the funds and the investment to be able to manage themselves on. And even if that fund is to come out of the public purse, there's not always a clear principle whereby in relation to achievement, this is the funding that can be done. It's more about arbitrary targets and arbitrary budgets. And then impositions about standards and qualities that come very often from outside. And so these are arbitrary targets. So what I'm wondering about is to what extent, if there is a deformation in capability inside the private sector, as people seem to be suggesting, that this might actually be part of a kind of habitual process of living with a dysfunctional governance framework, not autonomously part of the organization itself, but as it were sitting outside and affecting it. Is this a crazy notion?
I don't think it's crazy at all, Angus. Because I'm kind of living it every day, is how it feels, and I see a lot of nodding heads.
Yeah, it's in universities as well, of course.
Yeah.
If I could make a point.
Yeah.
All of these are organizations that are run by people, and people share general similarities. We all have the same biology. So I think I remember listening to a podcast once, it was about economics, and it was in response to somebody saying that, oh, private sector organizations are obviously going to be efficient because they're profit driven, and they're rational because they're profit driven. But one of the things the economist said was that people are irrational in their private lives and they bring their irrational self to work. So that, I'm really sorry, I've totally lost my train of thought. But my principal point that I was trying to say is that there is an underlying factor of people, and that may bear some similarity between these organizations, because ultimately, as you've said, we see these similar problems in private sectors, then it's not the fact that it's private or public which is the important denominator. That's not, because if it was the important difference, then we'd see a difference. There's some variable which is shared between them that means that this is happening. I hope that makes sense.
It does, Rory, and it gives me a really good segue to Tom in just a second, and we'll hear from Tom. So I was in conversation last night with an organisation called NTT Data, with a chap which Peter I'm sure will be familiar with, and chap I was talking to has replaced 6,000 people with a machine that does the work that the 6,000 people used to do, and I think it's data shuffling type activity, a very, very machine oriented. But
there's just one observation we should bear in mind here. What is actually happening is people are being overcome by complexity and the speed of change, and so the management, if you like, in many respects was better in Victoria times.
I think it was easier, Peter. There was less of it to do. In a sense.
And it was simple and it was linear. The world is no longer simple, as in mathematically it's complex. People are fundamentally incapable of making good decisions in a lot of situations, and that's why the machines have to replace us in a lot of situations. There's no other choice.
I'm going to take a
on
quick
that
one.
point, I made some research on.
I'll take a quick one from Richard because he had his hand up. Then I'm going to switch fairly rapidly. Is it a short one, Angus? Do Richard
Very short.
first.
Very short.
Richard first, then Angus, then Tom. Richard.
Yeah, John, thanks. I was just going to make the point of the organisation as a homeostat, and that's certainly what the conclusion I've come to in my own research, that in fact these systems, these meta systems, these institutions, as Chris has sort of articulated, literally are ultra stable, to use the Ashby terminology. Government as well, government itself is ultra stable, and that probably lies at the root of culture, behavior, systems, initiatives that constantly fail to deliver transformation, let alone change. So it was just to make that point, if I may, please.
So we're stuck where we are until, as Angus might suggest in other conversations,
John,
we move a barrier out of the way. Angus, for you, quickly, please.
Yes, so there are many changes between present day management and 19th and 18th century, obviously. But one of the things I have researched is accounting practices. And accounting practices in the 19th and 18th centuries were designed in order to be able to give information to management about what was actually going on in processes. What happened is that was all redesigned to give information to accountants about financial flows at the end of periods, so that the governance systems that accounting provided deteriorated very significantly and haven't caught up. There are some methods of overcoming it, but they're very, very infrequently adopted.
Thanks, Angus. David, is it very, very brief? I can see your hand's been waving for 5 minutes, so I've got to let you in, haven't I?
It usually happens that way. I recognise a great deal of what Chris says from the Parkinson's Law first business book, which I read, and it's generic across so many organisations. What distinguishes the police, to me, is that they work in very stressful situations at times with a great deal of power. As a consumer of the police facilitation of my right to protest in the last 10 years or so, I've seen some successes and some scope for development, and I think they could be a lot more effective and with better training for the vulnerable bobbies on the beat, some of whom get scared inappropriately, let's say, and that might not just be the public's fault.
Thanks, David. So, Raoul, I have seen your hand up. If I take one final thing from you, and
John,
then we really must move on to Thomas.
John, I would like to just comment. My impression from Chris's presentation was that he was very much giving the impression of a hierarchical type of leadership. And I didn't hear much about leadership as a way of bringing together people in a coordinated fashion so that they could collaborate and make their jobs better. Now, is this something where you, Chris, agree, or you are in disagreement, or you feel that I'm unfair? What is the situation?
Yeah, I mean, undoubtedly there is leadership that brings things together, and I mentioned that one example of, in local government, Carol Burgoyne bringing together. So undoubtedly there are situations where leadership does do that. I think, however, the impact of culture in the organisation, and particularly that hierarchical element, makes it harder for that to happen.
However, yes, I think you
How long do you pause before you move on? Okay. We'll come back to Raoul in a minute. Tom, are you still here? Yeah, I can see you. You're singing and dancing. Have you got slides to share and stuff like that?
I have. Can you give me permission?
I shall allow you to. You should be able to share now whenever you're ready. So, ladies and gentlemen, we will come back to that discussion, I hope, because Tom's going to tell us how to solve it all using a machine now, I believe. Is that right, Tom?
No, far from it, John.
So, Professor Tom Jackson, again, somebody I've worked with for 15 or 16 years now, I think, since we were both boys, at least he was. Professor of Information and Knowledge Management at Loughborough University, over 20 years research and industrial experience, and a founder of over 16 million of research funding, which I have to say is no mean achievement in the environment that you've been doing it in for so long, Tom. What does he say? Research areas include email, social media analytics, information retrieval, applied and theory-based knowledge management, and his natural language processing email knowledge extraction system, EEC, I love that, that has the world's best F ranking measure. We'll have to ask you what an F ranking is at some point, Tom. So without further ado, everybody, I'll hand you over to Tom Jackson.
Thanks, John. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, all good.
And you can see the slides?
Yeah.
Okay, so following on from Chris's presentation, I think this presentation is all about understanding feedback and data and trying to make good decisions from that. So good decision making, which is quite difficult. And tonight, I'm trying to put that into a product and service domain context. So the big question, what do people want? What do they need? How do we know what people want and what they need? And of course, on the right-hand side there, you can see a radio listening station where in the First World War and the Second and other world wars, it doesn't have to be world wars, of course, people listening to radio conversations to try and glean information and then try to put that together and make a decision off the back of that. So back in 1914, all the way through to now, things haven't really changed that much. And that's when I talk about Emotiv a bit later on, of how we are mining data to try and make some sense of it via social media. Of course, there's always the ethics element. So I've put one slide on ethics. We can obviously talk for days and days about ethics, but I think it's important that we do mention it. So how do we decide then what product or service to make, and how do we know if it's going to sell or it's going to fail miserably? Well, I found this wonderful, well, I thought it was wonderful, advert. Stop mouth breathing and snoring, the causes of many diseases and often an early grave. So, you know, when you're designing a product or a service, how do you know that it's going to go down extremely well and people are going to buy lots of them? And this has been a problem for centuries, decades. I just can't get my head around this actual advert I found today. I just think it's absolutely brilliant. You know, heals inflamed nasal tissues, also prevents flabby facial muscles. I think I'm going to get one. Double chin protruding, and then shapely lips, etc. It's just great. I want to buy one. It's only $3 too. Anyway, I digress. So how do we find out, you know, in terms of products, what people want and need, like I said at the very beginning? And there's many different processes out there you can find, but it all starts with an idea, which I think we always will agree on. And then, you know, how you get from the idea to actually launching it and selling it, there's many different ways of doing that. And this is just one of those ideas. So that's been a problem for a long time. And what concerns me the most is that many, I suppose, companies out there, well, all companies out there are interested in the bottom line and making money that we're talking about before. And that's a big driver. So not necessarily interested in the planet. They just want to produce anything they can and see if they can sell it. And I think it's time for a change. And that's where we're looking at Emotiv later on, in terms of, can we actually, by listening to what people are saying, get better at determining what products or services they really want? So this all comes back down to feedback, doesn't it? Feedback loops. So I think you probably agree on some of these. So, you know, one is sight, touch, and taste and smell, touch, sound, all key things to try and get some feedback on anything we do. And then there's proprioception. So it's kind of like the perception of how our body is actually moving. And then I think you might disagree on this. The seventh sense could be perception. So putting all the other senses together is quite an interesting one. It's been around for many years, hasn't it? Different perceptions. So your perception of this, these slides tonight is probably going to be very different to my perception, but hopefully not too different. So if we can understand someone's perception of something, isn't the world going to be much easier, because we see where they're coming from? So we talked about lots of discussions or lots of issues within the police force and different viewpoints, but it's also trying to understand those different viewpoints and come from those viewpoints to try and change those persons or people's thinking. So perception has been around for years, and you might say, well, they've produced products and services trying to determine someone's perception of something over years, and you're absolutely right. You know, you think about the focus groups and market research they do, but it normally comes in three set ways, really. I think, you know, you have 8 or 12 people in a room. They've been picked because they best represent where the company wants to try and place their product. So they either use some sort of questionnaire, which is quite fixed. Obviously, they have this focus group to try and work out if they like the product or they don't like the product, what's wrong with it. And of course, they interview people to try and elicit the information. But for me, that's very much an artificial environment for eliciting this information. It's one point in time of how you feel at that moment, which is fine, but I think we can do better moving forward. So we also know, and you're probably aware of this, and you've heard it many times before, around the Hawthorne effect. We know when people know they're being monitored, they can potentially change their behavior. And I think it's about 1933 in Chicago at the Hawthorne plant. They had 5 people on the production line, and they got some scientists in to see if they can increase productivity. So they changed the lighting. They increased the light level to see what impact that would have. And lo and behold, productivity went up. Being scientists, they thought that's not good enough. Let's just make sure this is true. So what they did is they then reduced the light level to lower than it was before. And lo and behold, productivity went up. So they deduced from that that actually monitoring someone can actually change their behavior, their natural behavior. I think actually in this study, I think it was flawed, because I think there were 5 people they studied and 3 of them were replaced. So who knows, the 3 they replaced with, they might have had a higher productivity to start with. But I think we'll probably all agree that if you are being watched, we do change our behavior. So I think it still holds. Now, if you think back to that radio listening station, the picture on the first slide, we've got the same now, really. If you think about what happens around the globe every 60 seconds in terms of social media, we've got something like over 5 million videos viewed every 60 seconds, 433,000 tweets sent every minute. We've got 2.6 million searches via Google. The one I like the most, which is declining over time, is email, actually. So it used to be something like 168 million sent every minute, and now it's down to 138 million. But that's because it's gone from email to something else. And the social media platforms are just absolutely huge. And it's all around, our digital sensors. So we all have mobile phones, and these are digital sensors. They're monitoring pretty much everything we do and every interaction. Which is, you might argue, is not ethical, but it does happen. So our question was, could we tap into this wealth of potential knowledge and do some listening to work out what people really want and what they really need? Now, it's down to perception. How do you then find some sort of harness to understand the perceptions of people? So then we started to look at sentiment. In particular, we looked at different emotions. So we know sentiment sits in the cloud, and people are quite willing to share their views, sometimes quite extreme views about various things, politicians all the way through to a product or service. The problem we have, I suppose a bit unlike the listening stations of past, we now have many more issues. One is noise. So there's a lot of rubbish, as you probably agree with this, a lot of rubbish out there on YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, etc. But in addition to that, we have bots. So bots are a computer program that are preloaded with messages, and they will send those messages out every 5 minutes, 1 hour, every day. You can decide how frequently they go out. And what's interesting about those bots is they can do a lot of damage to brands, politicians, etc. And we'll come on to an example a bit later on. There are many companies out there also that look at sentiment analysis. So that's one way of categorizing the perceptions. So it's either negative, positive, or neutral. But we'll find with many organizations that use them, the accuracy is really quite poor. And then generally, the quality of data out there, trying to sift through all these millions of tweets, for example, or Facebook posts, is extremely difficult. So we can listen and we can try and interpret, but we've got to overcome these barriers. So back in 2012, we started a program called Emotiv, and we're working with DSTL and UK government funding to see if we could predict the next London riot. If you remember the riot back in 2012, and it was all to do with, could we monitor social media posts? In particular, we were looking at Twitter to see how people or what people might do in the future. So try and predict what's happening. So you might say, well, absolute rubbish. What's on social media? Well, we know, I mean, the first quote I think is absolutely fantastic from the Egyptian activist, but we know social media breaks a lot of things first. So the Mumbai attacks, the Jakarta bombings, and the earthquakes. So we know there's some good content out there because, again, it comes back to, we are the sensors, we have a phone, we're at the scene first, and people are tweeting or posting about it just because they want to be famous, or there might be some other reasons. So our Emotiv system, some clever stuff in there. So we built this system to take the data from any social media platform. So we have to do a bit of natural language processing, so the parts of speech tagger, see how the syntax of a sentence is created, and then start to look at the semantics. And our harness for these perceptions was around a piece of work that Ekman did. I say a piece of work, he spent about 50 years looking at this, the cross-cultural emotions from around the world. So he came up with 6 and added one more, 7, and we added the 8th, confusion. So there are 8 different cross-cultural emotions that work right across the globe. So anger, confusion, disgust, fear, happiness, sadness, shame, and surprise. So we will parse all the text and then see if there are any emotions in any of the text we parse. And what it gives us then is a chart or a graph of all these different emotions. So let me show you on the next screen what that looks like. Before I do that, I forgot this slide was here. So you're probably thinking about, we started with perceptions and how we got to emotions. I just want to make this clear. So we're just looking at a lens of perceptions. So you could probably come up with many different lenses, and ours was just looking at the emotions in the perceptions. And why do we want to do that? Because we can't look at all the different messages out there. We have to try and refine it. And to try and filter that down, we want to look at what's really aggravating people or getting people interested. And that was all down to emotions. Hence, we had the emotion lens. So you probably remember the brutal killing of Lee Rigby back in 2013, and we're following the emotional outcry from that. And you can see from the right-hand side, so you've got all the, let me just get rid of that there. So you can see on the right-hand side, the different emotions, surprise all the way through to anger. Down the bottom, we've got the timeline, and left to right is the percentage of emotions. So you can see there's a lot of disgust and sadness, which you would expect. So from this, you can start to drill down by pressing a button, and it goes into the tweets that actually come out. So these are just a few examples. So obviously a lot of sadness that someone's been killed, and disgust of how the families or the victim, the family's victim, the other way around, the victim's family was being dealt with by the media. But what you don't expect to see here is happiness. So we're monitoring this, remember, for the 2012 riots to see what things might happen after the Woolwich attack. Is there going to be some reprisals? Well, the happiness was about Woolwich coming out and saying, you know, really proud about Woolwich, and also Lee Rigby's wife coming out saying, you know, she was so proud of to be his wife. And that changed, as you can see, pretty much the emotions that are coming out. So if you then added case-based reasoning to this, you can then start to look at how many mosques might be bombed or attacked off the back of this, and you can start to do some correlation between that and the emotions. But what I think is interesting is just by putting a few tweets out there, how the emotional feelings change and the perceptions change of the event, and how powerful words can be. So since 2012, we've done many different things. We looked at UK general elections, and we predicted the outcome by looking at the choppiness or the uncertainty towards political candidates. So we managed to predict the hung parliament that happened not so long ago. The Clinton-Trump election in the US also predicted the outcome in real time, and also the social uprising that followed that. It's also been used by the UN to look at chemical warfare across the globe. Something new we're trying to do is look at the detection of brain tumours. I'm working with Edinburgh. Something that we did now is by looking at social media content, we can look at 4 mental health conditions. So we can look at or diagnose that someone has it in terms of bipolar, SAD, depression, PTSD, which we used in the Paris bomb attacks, which we haven't got time to talk about tonight. That's another story altogether. So by using just this harness, this lens of emotion, we're starting to get some real insights just by looking at people's perceptions. So to put it into context again, we've used it with many different commercial organizations, and this is the sort of thing they get. So you can see at the top how many terms we've looked at on Twitter. It could be anything, of course, Facebook, unique users, emotional messages, and if we can geolocate those messages. And over time, you can see if this is a brand, you can see how, you know, there's a lot more sadness coming in over time for a particular brand, and they will then drill down to find out why people are actually sad and what they can do about that. So when we're working with an automotive company, we could then also use components, or sorry, categories, not components, categories. On the left-hand side, you can see there, and you can see the different emotions for those different categories. So before, if you think about mining all the social media data, trying to get insights from it can be very difficult because it's either positive or negative. Now you start to get the emotions that are aligned with these actual components. So they can also be negative, neutral within surprise, shame, sadness, etc. But you can start to drill down. Now the problem is bots. So we discovered there are a number of bots out there for various different brands. And for the automotive industry, fascinating that these bots, yes, some were individuals that were disgruntled customers and really hated a particular brand and were going for it and being very negative. Others seem to be from other manufacturers saying some very negative things about the other brand's car. However, when we digged a little bit deeper, they were not from the other manufacturer. They were state-run bots. So we had America versus Russia, America versus China regarding regarding vehicles, shall I say. So we use a system that can detect these bots. So you can now see, if you look at these emotions, so at the top you've got like a human, so not a bot, and at the bottom you've got a likely bot. So you can see just by this is real data from one organization. There's a lot of sadness towards their product and their brand, whereas on the other side you've got lots of happiness that's from an actual human. So already the impressions, so if people are reading the social media posts, are getting impressions from what people say, it's changing their perception. And that can be very damaging for the brand, the product, or the service. So again, just showing you 4 different vehicles here: the Ford Ranger, X-Class, Toyota Hilux, and the VW Amarok. And again, over the bottom, you can see from July to November, and you can see the different emotions. And this was very key for the automotive industry because they start to see, if they're doing marketing campaigns, how does it change their perception of their cars? Or is someone saying, putting something out there, we can go down all the way down to the low level detail of what's wrong with a component in the car. Now, if we had more time, we could go back, how does that actually manifest itself from the production line, and trying to do some correlation between the comments and who put the car together. That's a story for another day. The high level thing in terms of, this is another interesting slide, I think, working with the vehicle manufacturers, they were building cars for a particular age group. And it turned out that that age group actually weren't that interested in the car. It was a totally different age group. So the marketing campaign got all wrong, just because they weren't looking at who was talking about their car. And also they've got it wrong in terms of who they thought it was going to be aimed at. Was it going to be the residential, or was it going to be the commercial vehicle side of things? So this dashboard just roughly gives you what percentage of the data we're looking at is created by a bot and non-bot, the male-female breakdown, the organization, and the age filter. Again, very useful for the organizations. So they just gleaned an awful lot of information by listening to what people are saying out there, and you just wouldn't get that from the current lenses of being negative, neutral, or positive. They just don't get the insights. So my question to you guys, I suppose, is this a new era for product design? It could be a new era for anything. You know, we've gone in the old days of doing this process, but we've seen like the government nowadays, they want to see if something's going to fly, so they fly the kite. Well, of course, you can fly the kite very easily now on social media. You're coming up with a new product, you know, one of these face masks to help your nasal passage and to stop an early grave. You can put it out there and see what people think. There are, of course, other dimensions that we haven't got time to talk about tonight in terms of influences and how that changes perceptions of brands and products. But by listening and finding a lens to try and understand these perceptions, I think we do get a greater insight into what people want and what people need. So like I said, we're nearly there, John. I think we're probably nearly over time. Ethics, it's a really important one, but where do we start? We could spend a whole evening talking about ethics. The stuff we didn't analyze at an individual level, but many companies do. When we speak to students, they're not really aware of the terms and conditions they're signing up to on these social media platforms, which pretty much means they can use their data for absolutely anything. And what we are finding is the perceptions of different generations change over time towards their media being monitored and used. So when we speak to students at first, they're absolutely fine with it. At the end of the module, they find that actually their views have certainly changed, all the way through to 50s, 60-year-olds thinking it's okay, it's not okay. So it's not one size fits all. What I do welcome is the Apple approach, which you might be aware of, is that they've now given that control back to the user. So if you're using something like Meta, which used to be called Facebook, you have control if they actually mine all your data and you put cookies on your Apple machine. What does that mean for Facebook? Well, that means that their revenues are hugely down because they're not making so much money because they're not collecting so much data. So that is, well, you view that how you like. There is the other side, flip side of the coin, that if we started putting cancer research data together with your Tesco Club card, we could probably start to understand what causes cancer much quicker than if we didn't. And again, that's a personal preference, even if they were going to do that. So again, it's an ethical thing. If we cut off everything, then we're probably going to cut off our nose to spite our face. And we need some sort of approach that fits, I think, works for both sides. I mean, you look at Meta making billions of pounds a year. Are they reinvesting that into how cancer is caused? No. So just to finish off with our original image of social listening. So it's something it's been around for many years. It's something that's not new. It's just the technology or the platforms have changed. You probably know this already, but your smart TVs, your Alexa Dot, your smartphones, they're all listening. They're all collecting information on you all the time to try and offer you a better service or product. And, we could talk about life insurance or the rest of it, but again, that's for another day. So we also know perception's been there for some time. Is it the new seventh sense? I think it is there, and we've got to find different lenses to understand the perception and how we can read that perception. So it comes back to, remember, we talk about decision making, understand the feedback. That's absolutely got to be there. The other big question, and put it out there, is a bit of I don't know, but can this technology lead to a greener planet? Can we start to understand what we really want from a consumer's point of view? And of course, our irony there is that the power consumption needed for our mobile phones and the social media platforms and the mining of cryptocurrency probably outweighs that. But it's just an interesting, I thought, hopefully, despite a bit of debate even. John, over to you.
Superb, Tom. 24 minutes, 24:51. So you nicked a minute on Chris, but that's absolutely fine. Really good. So I've written down so much, seeing the connections between those two things, and Raoul has finally managed to make it back to the room, so that's good. Because Richard, you flagged up some questions about Chile, and of course Raoul was in Chile at the time working with Stafford, so he would have insights to that, which we'll point him back in a minute. So I want to start with an interesting one, Tom. In amongst the various things for which Boris Johnson and his playmates are in trouble, frankly most of which are confected crises, the one that's got the least attention in the press but probably should have had the most is the behaviour of the so-called nudge unit particularly during the period of the pandemic, and that's actually been now held to account by the National Audit Office, and all sorts of other interesting people are having a go. But it is doing precisely what it is that you're suggesting can be done, which is trying to understand the emotions that are going on in society, and trying to understand government messaging and how that messaging plays through into the way we all behave as a as a population. So you got any sort of thoughts on that immediately before we sort of let the tigers loose to rip you to shreds?
I'm looking forward to being ripping to shreds. Well, in a way, John, think about propaganda. It's been around for years, hasn't it? You think about all the wars and stuff, and that's all it is, really. It's understanding where people are coming from and then putting out propaganda to make sure they follow where you want them to go. So I don't think anything's really changed, but we're just becoming more aware of how we are being manipulated.
So actually, we have an advantage in being aware, as opposed to not knowing. So it's a good thing that we know.
I agree. It is a good thing that we know. There's more awareness, but for the general public, I don't think they are so aware that they are being manipulated. You think about the Cambridge Analytica debacle in terms of they were making sure of trying to get votes for certain parties by presenting the right message and marketing to them. Is that a step too far, or is that okay?
We shall find out. Raoul, welcome back. We realised we'd lost you towards the end of your comment, and what I want to do is I want to come to Richard Berry first. So Richard, apropos whatever you put in a notion in the chat about happy and sad and you can't even say eudaimonia and cyberfolk in Chile, would you like to sort of elaborate a little? Because I think Raoul, having been there at the time, may have a view that would be helpful.
Yeah, thanks, John. I've got most of that. You're still very quiet on my screen, so forgive me if I didn't quite hear everything. Well, I was just raising the point that there's perhaps nothing new around all of this. It's just in a different form. And eudaimonia, the idea of, I think it's Aristotle, isn't it? Of that kind of happy human existence, or that better human existence, and the way it was used by Beer in designing these kind of feedback mechanisms, particularly for freedom and accountability, and the way it was tried to be introduced into Chile, and into the kind of cyberfolk idea. That seems like a really positive way. With some perhaps ethical concerns as well. So kind of the same issues that Tom's raising for us this evening.
Raoul, do you want to come in and talk
Well,
about...
I have lost context, but I can just mention that this idea of eudaimonia and cyberfolk was a very significant aspect of our project. And in a way, what it implied is something that is very relevant to today's world, which that's where I'm not sure whether the context is okay. In those days, it was very easy for ministers or people at the top of the government to contact the people through the television or media. On the other hand, for the people to contact politicians or managers in general was much more difficult. Simply, the feedback loop back was totally inadequate. And that's precisely what cyberfolk tried to do. What it tried to do was to increase the channel capacity of the people to the politicians, the directors, the managers, and whether that increased happiness is a matter of asking people themselves, but in a way, it was anticipating a problem that we have today, because the problem we have today is exactly the opposite. Is too much data arriving to managers, to politicians, and making it very difficult for them to respond in a reasonable way to the demands and the requests of people. So that's the kind of thing that we were doing in those days. I don't know whether it helps or not.
Oh, I think the conclusion that my mind came to was that the technology has changed, but the principles of the communication really haven't. But who's now got the advantage? And I think, Richard, your research in policing is saying that, in effect, the bad actors have the advantage these days because they're faster, more agile, they're probably even more capable than Chris's friends in the force. Is that fair?
Yeah, absolutely, John. I would coin a phrase, survival of the fastest is perhaps a way to look at it.
So we've got a link here coming out then. So between Chris, your very operational policemen doing their very operational policing thing, an evident lack of effective feedback loops, at least about what's going on in the community. So can we start to fix that, Chris, by picking up ideas such as Emotiv, for example? Could we use that to inform our senior officers better?
I think the short answer is yes. Rich and I will both have experience of attempts to do that. So some years ago, 18 years ago, the National Intelligence Model attempted to do exactly that. And indeed, then later than that, other things. I mean, Emotiv clearly has been a predictive tool on the back of the riots, and there's been other bits and pieces as well for that. I think one of the and leadership has embraced those opportunities, because actually leadership, perversely, despite what I was saying earlier, to see that there is opportunity through that smarter working, and ultimately, of course, it delivers what policing is seeking to achieve. We want to keep people safe. I think the things that conspire against it, however, is distrust. The culture is one where, particularly in policing, that there is distrust of the new, the shiny, and what have you. And then secondly, the complexity, which will get a fixed solution for tomorrow, but will be fit for the purpose that we intend it for the day after tomorrow. And then finally as well, and I put this in the chat, which was, what is effective? So David said earlier, you know, exercise his right to protest. Fantastic. What does effective policing look like in regard to that? Well, David would say, I was able to attend the protest, I was able to raise my voice, I was able to do this, that and the other. But of course, for David's voice, there will also be a number of others who'd say, you did what? You allowed them protest? We don't want bloody protest on our streets. We want an absence of protest. So what is effective? Is it an absence of protest? Now the law will say actually it's the balance, right? Because it's a human right to protest. So I think there's a number of things at play that mean that the solution isn't as simple as simply providing the right inputs.
Anybody want to come in? I'm looking at a lot of blank screens at the moment, David. Gerard, you're on mute.
Basically, okay, I'm demuted now. I think...
Let David go first, Gerard, and we'll come back. Go on, David.
Can I say something? Or
hang on, Gerard. Let David go, and then we'll come to you next.
I say, as a consumer of police facilitation of the right to protest, I think we need to question the ostensible motivations of both protesters and sometimes police. There's an element of theatre from both sides, which is kind of self-justificatory. There is an element of enjoyment and pleasure in both protesting and in handling a protest. In a way, you could say both sides are in the same conspiracy to justify themselves to the public, and they need one another. I think there's a simplicity of perception, and when we talk about what the goal is, I mean, in some ways protest is a safety valve and it's a cover-all. Sometimes it creates something useful, like perhaps votes for women, arguably, although, you know, my granny as a suffragist was very against the violent element there. There's a lot of complex dynamics in this, and some police get it, some don't. Likewise, some protesters, and of course there are many, many ways of handling and interacting. I mean, some people like to talk with either side. Some people say, don't do that under any conditions. There are many more subtle dynamics than the simple analysis of prime goals, ostensible prime goals, actually picks up.
Thanks, David. Gerard.
I'm changing a bit the topic, so I apologize for that, even though I would like to respond to David. I want to ask Tom Jackson, your first question was that you said, what do people want? That, in the course of your contribution, changed into to what extent are people satisfied with what they get? That is not the same. So, for example, what do people want? They don't want anger, they don't want confusion, they don't want disgust. So would it be possible to apply your approach instead of asking people about their anger, asking them and making it possible for them to contribute what they actually want?
Well, so there's a lot packed into that question. So in terms of we don't actually ask them if they're angry or confused, the system determines if they're, you get that. And in terms of what they want, when we work with the vehicle manufacturers, they determine from the feedback on the cars what they do want in the car. So they want extra cup holders or they want reduced cup holders. So down at the very minute level of vehicle manufacturing, that's a massive deal for them because they only make about £100 on a car. So if they can remove a cup holder, which maybe costs them 30–40p on mass volume, that saves them a fortune. So this type of system for these types of manufacturers saves them, well, millions a year. So it is determining what people want, and you could also, like you say, if you wanted to, you could ask people what do they want. But that comes back then, Gerard, to that snapshot in time. And what we're trying to do is over a longer period of time to see if their behavior changes towards a product or a service.
Well, I have some reactions to that, but if that's allowed.
Yeah, sure. It's a conversation. We'll crack on.
Okay. Identifying reactions, of course, is not impossible. There are whole areas of study, for example, to identify Bayesian changes given further information. So the question is actually, is it possible to actually identify what people want? I have a very simple example. I was chair of a committee, and in the beginning, people always expressed things like anger, you are doing it wrong, unhappiness, and things like that. And I changed that and said, let us consider what you want. So tell me what you want, and I will do it. And that changed the whole conversation. So in terms of the actual dynamics of an interaction between people, it's very different from asking them about their emotions and asking them what they actually want to contribute in the collective where they are working. So to my mind, I agree fully that you interposed an interpretation system from certain statements into anger and into fear. But that wasn't actually what people were saying, in my view. So I'm not saying that you're wrong. I'm only saying I wonder why what people want is most frequently neglected.
I think quite often, Gerard, what people want is what we've persuaded them that we think they want.
No. Listen to people, and they tell you what they want. I mean, it is possible for me to impose on people what they want, but we are talking about listening. If you listen, they will tell you what they want, and they are very happy to tell you under what constraints they want what they want.
Thank you. So I'm going to go to Rory and then Richard, if that's okay. So Rory.
Okay, I'm going to absolutely butcher your lecture and what you told us at university. But I wanted to touch on the black box principle. And if we consider, could I be really annoying and ask you to mute yourself? The echo is quite distracting, John. Sorry to be picky. Thank you. If we touch on the black box principle, if we consider humans as a system, then can we really fully understand them? And if we look at understanding as what people actually want, can we fully understand them? Well, if we apply that principle of cybernetics, no. So all we can really do is do exactly what Tom has said, which is use Emotiv to manipulate the system and see what the response is. And that's all we can really do. Because as humans are a system, they're a black box, we can't fully understand them. And I think I wanted to touch on the point of, if you ask people what they want, they will tell you. Well, not necessarily, because to tell somebody what you want depends on so many factors as to whether you tell them exactly what they want. As to what Tom Jackson said about the Hawthorne studies, is that if somebody knows that they're being listened to, if you're having a conversation with somebody, depending on who that person is, can influence what you say. And if you don't actually know what you want as a person, or you can't communicate it effectively, then that's not going to be effective. But ultimately, I really just wanted to bring up that point of the black box principle, that can we really fully understand what people want? Possibly not. What we really need is a metric that is as close as possible to what somebody actually wants. And what Emotiv is trying to do, to paraphrase what Tom Jackson has said, is to try and find a metric that is as close to true satisfaction and what somebody wants as possible. Because if we do apply that black box principle, we can't fully understand people anyway.
Thanks, Rory. I think that's really interesting, because I think I'm listening to it and you're picking up Gerard's point as well. Yes, absolutely, you've got to listen and you've got to respond. So you end up with a dialogue. You end up with a conversation, we might call it, in which the error between what you're offering and what's being sought gets damped over time when you get to a point of stability, hopefully, in the relationship between what's being offered and what's being sought. So, and if you're in the commercial world, if you keep offering what people don't want, you very rapidly go bust. In the public sector, if you don't offer what people want, they just increase your grant, it would appear to me. There is no failure in the public sector in that regard, is there, gentlemen? But that's kind of where we need to be thinking about the question of purpose. I think, Chris, you raised that very, very early on. Why are we doing what it is that we are doing? How do we know whether we're doing it well? And then the question about how do we fund it becomes a really important one. So, Richard, I was going to you next, and I saw your hand again, Rory, so we'll come back to you in a minute, don't worry.
Yeah, it's just some very quick fire points for Tom, really. Probably already on it, but it did strike me that another application for the Emotiv approach could be within the emerging online harms bill. So the scenario of trolling being a really interesting volume issue in a lot of scenarios, Tom. And of course, those scenarios quite often end up with the police, and the police, that generates work, it generates a huge demand, a huge variety, entropy entering the system in many respects. I just wonder if there's something really positive in terms of filter and sort and response that Emotiv could do to that emerging legislation to try and keep people safer.
Thanks, Richard. There's quite a bit of feedback, John, for your live mic.
I shall tell you then, Tom. I turned it up because Richard said it was too quiet, and since I turned it off, So I'll turn it back down again and you'll have to whisper.
Just to come back to Richard. No, I can still hear it, John. Still feedback. When you turn it off, there's no feedback. Perfect. Can't hear John. That's lovely. I'm joking. Richard, no, I hadn't considered that. We did look at bullying many years ago, and we didn't know how to cope with it because it would be pinging all the time. And then we thought, does the school, the parent, or the police get involved? And where do you go with that? So if you don't mind, let's speak offline and see where we could potentially take it, because I haven't even considered that. So thanks, Richard, for that one.
No, don't look at me. I'm busy here unmuting my microphone. Is that better, Tom?
It makes a massive difference that you don't get any feedback when someone else is speaking. Two other people speaking, and you got your mic live. Is a lot of feedback. There's an echo, shall I say?
Feedback needs to be damped. Discussed.
Rory, you wanted to come back in.
Well, it was about feedback tonight, so we're definitely getting it.
Rory.
I think you must have misinterpreted some of my body language, because I did not have an interjection. But if I do, I will raise my hand more forthrightly and obviously this time.
Not a problem. Anybody else, David?
I mean, so many aspects to this. Obviously, the more information you have, the more good you can do, the more harm you can do. We need to develop the public dialogue about what are permissible usages in all of these areas, and recognize that it's just not one side construing the other. People construe back against you. Many protesters are absolutely fascinated by the dynamics and the thought processes of the police, and obviously vice versa. And you will get this sort of thing when people know that their thoughts are being, their emotions are being monitored. And as I said, it's the silent, the people who say nothing, who can sort of kick you in the backside, surprisingly, occasionally. So a lot of people don't participate in public debates or anything because they're just disillusioned or suspicious and so on. So while this is a valuable tool, it's clearly not sufficient. And I mean, yeah, we can always go back to ethics, which is easy to agree on, except when you actually sort of spell out the details. And obviously, what do people really know what they want? Well, I certainly have conflicting wants in myself, and you know, there's a whole psychotherapy industry based on this. But you know, I mean, let's keep going. Let's build this sort of escalating competencies all around and see where it takes us, because we probably don't have much choice.
Thank you. Colin, I saw you put my name in the chat and then nothing happened. You're going. Also, I'll say, in that case, come back next time, please, because we always welcome more and more guests to come in. And
I've thoroughly enjoyed it. It was outstanding. Thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you. Thanks for going. Thanks for joining us. Now, Rory, is that a pen in your hand or are you waving?
I did want to interject. It was a question stroke statement, because most of the time we try to ask a question, but it usually turns into a statement. Is the problem with the ethics side of Emotiv and the use of data is not the actual action itself, but the fact that power is too concentrated? So if we take a look at government, if we had a dictator, if we had a tyrannical single person for our government who was pulling the strings for our entire country, we'd probably have a problem with it. But because it's a democratically elected state with lots of people that we can choose from, we have less of a problem with government controlling us. So is the ethical side not that data is being used to try and sell us more things, to profit off of us, to manipulate us, but the fact that there's only a select few people currently that are able to do it, like people like Meta, people like Alphabet, who have so much power, and that's the real issue?
Who wants first go at that one? Tom, Tom, looking at you and Chris and Richard, because I think there's some good starting points there, and I have my own views inevitably. So, yeah. Rich, you put your hand up first. So let Tom and Chris think.
Wow. So there's a lovely book here, Mike Chertoff's Exploding Data, and the most dangerous threat we individually face is the loss of our freedoms and the pervasive exposure of our personal information. We're absolutely driven by information, whether that's law enforcement, surveillance as a service, or surveillance for service in the commercial environment. And at the moment, Emotiv, as Tom has really fantastically explained, is just simply what we want to put out there. There are lots of things that are collected that you don't know are being collected and being utilized. So things like metadata around the content that you're using. It's when you start aggregating data sets, then you start to get into some really, really intrusive views of people's lives, existence, and so forth. Whether it can be used for goodness or badness is, I think, the crux of the social debate. That it is, we cannot change. It's about how we influence it for good, I think, ultimately. Whether or not data gets weaponized as something that is, internationally used is really interesting. I was reading an article today around Q-Day. So when quantum comes along and it starts breaking a lot of the crypt that exists at the moment, there are going to be a lot of folks potentially exposed in a lot of ways, and a lot of vulnerabilities for organizations. That's potentially a game changer as well. So I think it's around that social debate that maybe David was kind of outlining, that perhaps we ought to just focus on, so what do we mean by intrusion? What do we mean around levels of acceptability? And it's not just the state, it's very much commercial surveillance as well.
Thanks, Richard. Chris, I'll come to you and then I'll go to Tom.
Yeah, I mean, clearly I'm going to echo much of what Richard said, and I think that last point that he made about the commercial aspects, and people worry about information that's held in the hands of the state. Actually, we should be more worried about the information held in the hands of Tesco's or whoever else it might be, because I can certainly think of situations where the data that we were able to gather from commercial outlets that painted a picture of a person's life was far in excess of that was available through our own systems. I would also echo Rich in terms of that's the nature of the social debate that needs to happen. What we do is we seek to regulate, don't we, in relation to how the state uses information. So we seek to, for instance, control what surveillance looks like. It's now legislatively laid down. We seek to control the state's use of data in relation to it. At the same time, that self-same regulation and control seeks to eliminate the risk of misuse of that data, both by the state and by any other actor. So the same sets of legislation also seek to control misuse of data, not only by the state, but also by criminal actors. And it's the balance between those two positions that we've got to strike and strike right. You will always find, and I do a lot of work with the military, and the military in particular, some of the more discreet units that exist in the military, they will always talk about wanting the better weaponry, the most advanced gadgetry, or whatever else it might be. Policing, elements of the state will always say the same things. We want to know more. We want to be able to do more. We want to be able to do this. So there's always that reach, if you like, in relation to the extent to which things are exploited. It's a matter for us now as citizens to then seek to influence the extent of that debate. We know if we wanted an entirely safe society, we know we could completely remove terrorist incidents. we could make air travel totally safe. We just would never ever consent to it because it would take so long, it would be so intrusive that the public would never consent to it. We tried it with speed cameras. And the public eventually said, do you know what, I think we've had enough of this. Seeking to stop killing people on the road due to excess speed, so we put speed cameras up, and now people are saying, actually, I don't consent to that. So it's the way in which we listen to that message, I think, is as key as anything else. Listen, you know, and that, David, is through protest, the Kill the Bill protests. I think you're probably missing the point comprehensively in the relation to the content of the bill itself. But you know, that's a voice that's equally as important to listen to. So there's a huge amount at play in relation to this.
Thanks, Chris. And Tom?
I agree with everything that's been said, to be honest. I think David started, first of all, you can use this for good and for bad. And with any technology, it's always the same. It just depends how far we want to go. And it comes back to the question, what do people want? What do people need? And everyone has a different perception on what that is. And I don't think we're ever going to become or get to the point where everyone agree on exactly what should be done and what shouldn't be done. You can see it moving, and we haven't had time to talk about this tonight. You know, we're talking about digital twins in manufacturing. So you have components on the production line and you've got a digital twin of that component, so you know exactly how it behaves. We're moving, unfortunately, I say, but maybe it's not unfortunate. We're moving to having a digital twin of you, John, for example, so we know exactly how you make your decisions. And we're starting to build systems like that over time. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? I don't know. You know, we go back to the argument that if you use Tesco club card data with cancer research data, and you can start to reduce cancer, we know how cancer comes about, then that's got to be a good thing. But like Chris said, you know, Tesco using your club card data, my goodness, they can do an awful lot of things with that. They're very advanced. So it comes back to the ethics, and David's right, you know, ethics is a great word, but what's written down, no one actually agrees with. And depending where you are in the country or in the world, it has a different meaning totally. So, you know, GDPR is great, you know, in EU and maybe in the UK, and we've got our own GDPR stuff now, but the rest of the world doesn't necessarily recognize that whatsoever. So you've got then the issue of where the data is stored, which it might not be in this country, it might be in a country somewhere else that has different laws. And of course, we've got the legal, if you're using it here, then it has to abide and all the rest of it. But it gets very grey, very grey. The borders are very blurred. So the ethics debate will rumble on, and I've got no answer for it.
Thanks, Tom. I think I see your hand, Raoul. I'll come to you in just a second. I was going to say a couple of thoughts from me, and one is, I think it was Norbert Wiener who said there's nothing inherently good or bad about any technology. It's all about the way we choose to use it. So there's a sort of a bit of thinking there that we need to reflect on. And I'll throw this in as a question more than an answer, which we can maybe circle back to if we do have a little more time, because Rory's question also talked about the dominance of certain services, certain systems like, you know, Facebook and so on. And for me, to a very large extent, that's our own stupid fault, because we insist on using Google and we insist on using Facebook, so they become dominant. And of course, they trade on that and they enjoy it. But if you're like me and you use DuckDuckGo, or you use a sort of slightly bizarre or slightly out of off-center search engine, and you refuse to have an Amazon account, you can disrupt the hegemony, Rory, to some degree. Raoul, you had your hand up, so let me bring you back in.
Yes, I think the point I wanted to raise is that I have heard very little about social organization in a way of bringing together all kinds of checks and balances throughout society, and finding out good ways to balance the high variety of certain aspects in society with a controlled variety of others. And by increasing our quality of organization, the chances are that we will be able to understand better, we will understand better undue controls and increase the chances of people defending their own positions and avoiding the overwhelming control of the few in positions of power. And organization is not strictly institutions, it is ways of relating, functions that are required in society to help dealing with this extraordinary surveillance and abuse of power.
Thank you. I've got a note actually, I think it's from one of our previous conversations, Raoul, that says organisation emerges from the interaction of people. And we you know, for the purposes of commerce, we put legal boundaries around those things, but actually it's all about the people interacting that the organisation emerges from. And that takes me, I'm going to go right back to very, very early on. I hope you can still hear me, Chris, with your plugs out. I wrote many years ago, we are what, you know, we do what we do because we are who we are. And you said very early on, we do what we do because we do what we do. So is there, and I'm just sort of thinking now, connecting learning in organizations, a sort of reflexive process that Tom's been describing in Emotiv. We can hear our customers and we modify what we do because we can hear what they're saying. And Gerard's flagged that issue as well about listening to your customers. What would we need to do in let's call it institutional leadership, public sector leadership, to create an environment in which those leaders were, should we say, enabled to listen to the messages in the environment that surrounds them?
Yeah, gosh, and there's no short answer, John. I think you start by principles that I would go back to sort of people like Deming for, and that is the principles around leadership. And you know, there is a lacuna in various organisations, I think, in relation to really understanding what the function of leadership is about, and the temptation to speak first rather than listen. So I think there's that. I think in terms of the second bit, I think also there that comes into play would be allowing leaders, enabling leaders to really understand the nature of the question that they're seeking to answer. And I think, you know, clearly that's harder, and the debate that we've heard this evening to a large degree sort of underlines that. But all too often, leadership fails to adequately understand the question that it's being asked, and will start to deliver solutions before it's fully in possession of all of the relevant information. And I think that probably, and you know, we particularly see that, of course, born out of directed political leadership, or born in directed political leadership, where you'll get a very quick judgment. It's because of this, you know, Home Secretary pushing people back across the channel. That's the solution. That's the solution to the channel migrant issue. We'll push them back. We'll get the Navy deployed. And it's all crap. It's absolute crap. And that sort of sense of failing to understand what the question is, it's only not only in the macro level endeavors that comes apparent, but it also plays out in the micro level as well. And I think it has a real impact on organizations. So there's a bit of a long answer to your question there, but I mean, hopefully I think that sort of gives a flavor of, I think, where things may need to go.
Again, I don't think there's an easy answer. I see your hand, Gerard. I think in my head, I'm thinking if, as seems to be the case, people get promoted to senior ranks in the system because they conform to what the system requires, then the chances of getting any truly radical thinking going on at the most senior level decline over time. So maybe it's time to shut down some of the old institutions and have new ones. So maybe defund the police has a point, in the sense of there's a need for a radical reinvention, and we can't do it within the constraints of the existing system. So defund the police and reinvent policing. So Gerard, you have your hand up.
Yes. It's not that I disagree with what's being said, but I think it's also important to link different ways of thinking. So Chris said something extremely important in my understanding, which is that it is possible to create a society which is extremely safe, but there is a resistance. And I think that is one of the major difficulties that we are facing. Rory indicated that we have to use and find a metric. But a metric is precisely what Chris said is resented. So the major problem, to my mind, is that we have the tendency, just like in the police, to think that we think is what is good. But by having a certain understanding of operationalization and making quantified measures, we impose on people something that they will resent. And I think we should step out of that thinking. Well, I think that Chris would agree with that.
Thank you. Richard, do you want to respond to that since you've logged a comment into the chat?
Now, apologies, I've got, there's not echo, but it's certainly an audio problem. Can you just repeat the nature of the question?
So I just picked your comment.
No, you've gone, John, completely. Is it about the comment I put in the chat? Yeah, okay. Hopefully you can still hear me. Can I, am I coming through? Yeah, great, okay. Yeah, I mean, that issue of permissible loss of freedom, again, nothing kind of new for societies in this. And Rousseau, you know, was exploring that in the idea of the social contract round about revolutionary France. And prior to that, Montesquieu, with his ideas of the spirit of the laws, very much looking at dividing power up. So there wasn't absolute power to create that kind of dystopian dictatorship. So I think, you know, the idea of conformity, the idea of how much freedom we actually want to give up, the idea of a social contract, for me, is quite scary. I wouldn't want to see that sort of being taken forward, but we don't have a mechanism at all for creating that sort of barometer of what's acceptable and what isn't. It's done through these old institutions. We call it Parliament, and, you know, the voice of the MP. You know, is that truly representative of the kind of feedback that the populace really want to give those in control? I think there's some really fascinating questions, but the point I was going to make, John, is, you know, we were or others were talking about this in pre-revolutionary France.
And I think it's a healthy thing that it's being talked about rather than being resolved. So in the sense, the point is the debate rather than the answer. For me, it's, you know, if we're able to have the dialogue, we're probably enjoying enough freedom to be able to have the dialogue. And if we can't have the dialogue, then we're probably over constrained. So there's something in there that says, if we're able to have this argument, then we're probably living in the sort of country where we can have the argument and nothing more. I mean, David, you suggest the law of requisite variety suggests absolute control is impossible. Do you have any comment to add to that, or, you know,
well,
does it matter?
I have produced a paper saying that the law of requisite variety is not a law, but it is practically useful as a strategy in a lot of situations. And could we end terrorism? I think it's about hearts and minds, guys, rather than force. We all know how, you know, you can always strengthen your enemy by attacking them, whereas ignoring them, you know, might lead them to wither away. So these are pretty subtle matters which human beings have been playing around with for recorded history, I would say, at least, and clearly it is possible for, I mean, the continuum between parasitism or exploitation and mutualism, cooperation, is a continuum, not a binary. This is the case in biology, and I think this is the case in society, and we will argy-bargy with one another about where the divide is. And I clearly get more benefit from the activity of the police than any negative. Not everybody in the middle classes appreciates that, and yeah, you'll get different attitudes from different levels of society. There is scope. I mean, I feel sure I could sort of tell various police how they could do their job by their own standards more effectively, but then I'm a, you know, a guy in their 8th decade. We usually believe that we've got the answer by then.
That's the perfect stopping point. Ladies, gentlemen, it's very nearly 7 o'clock. We're rocking up to the end. Is it very, very brief, Rory?
I can make it brief. I just wanted to give a point of agreement to what Chris said, is actually understanding what you're trying to do is of great importance. And because I did a fair amount of reading into wicked problems after your lecture, and one of the features of a wicked problem is that understanding the problem is the solution. So I think potentially as the world becomes more complex and we become more interconnected, particularly with technology, that problems are going to become more wicked. So there is a greater need, as Chris said, for understanding of the problem in order to find the solution. If that wicked theory, or if that feature of wicked problems holds true.
Wow. So excellent. Thank you, Rory. I used to kid myself when we started doing these nearly 2 years ago now, that I could provide a brief and insightful summary at the end and feature the major points made by both speakers, but I've sort of long given up on that idea. Can I just first say thank you to Chris and to Tom for the energy and effort to put their thoughts and provocations together for us and presenting them so articulately. So we'll clap in the usual way and say thank you. Thank you to all of you for joining in the discussion and debate. It makes my life an awful lot easier if you do ask all the questions, so I'm all in favour of that. Next month we are doing something different. We've got John Randall joining us from Rolls-Royce, and John is going to be talking to us about the application of theoretical models in consulting practice and how that works, or quoting Chatham House rule again, sometimes doesn't. So we'll have a sort of a more of a debate based on that next month rather than the two-parter, but and then we do something else again in April. So you can book the next one now if you want to. It's all available on Eventbrite because I've been administratively efficient today. Thank you very much to you all for turning up, and I look forward to seeing you again in a few weeks' time. Thanks a lot.